I want to welcome everybody on the SpareMin app. I'm speaking right now with Charles Cassidy. He runs an organization called Evidence-based Wisdom, which translates academic research regarding the science and psychology of wisdom into understandable and helpful resources for the wider public. And we're here to talk about our current political climate of alternative facts and how information disseminates. Thank you so much for being with us, Charles.
Matthew, thanks for having me on the show. I'm really looking forward to having a good chat.
So let's talk a little bit about the organization that you operate, Evidence-based Wisdom. Tell us a little bit about your work and how that deals in the political sphere and the current crisis we have with regard to trust in our journalistic institutions.
Sure. Well, my background is physics, actually, so unless something can interesting to chat about, but I can't get that excited about unless there's some sort of evidence to support it, and I think that's the scientific, training. So wisdom is this, fantastic idea, this sort of pinnacle of insight into the understanding of how one should live a good life. But it's always something I'd kind of chatted about over a coffee late night as a student, but not really thought one could particularly take it any further. And then sort of a few years I was looking at University of Chicago's research projects, and they were starting something called the Defining Wisdom Project, and they were essentially trying to get some empirical data around this construct. And for me, this was incredibly exciting. It was you have this huge idea about living a wise life, and then you have the scientific method, which is this incredibly powerful tool, turning its gaze onto this concept. So for me, this was a really exciting time and something I really wanted to get involved with. So that's kind of how I came to set up the project. And then as far as the sort of Trump situation goes, you find in the world that I'm working, there's often there are polls done about who's the wisest person ever, kind of thing. And people that turn up at the top of those lists are very similar. It's often Martin Luther King, Winston Churchill, Mother Teresa, and Gandhi, of course. Gandhi is often, across different cultures, across different age groups, people are always coming back to Gandhi. So when I was railing against what had happened back in November, this kind of image came to me of how would someone who we know to be wise, like Gandhi, how would he deal with this current situation we find ourselves in? And it just struck me as quite a contrasting, shocking image, Gandhi and Trump, very much two ends of the wisdom scale. So I was keen to see what I could mine from the research to say, how could this perhaps be helpful from this wisdom research? Is there anything in there that could kind of give us a bit of a clue as to how to get out of this situation?
And in that sense, what do you see a clear path in that way? I think everybody I speak to in the bubble of the East Coast media elite here in the United States, or coastal media elite here in the United States, there's this sense of something is broken that cannot be repaired. Do we have examples of history of this being repaired short of violent global conflict?
Well, I mean, obviously today I don't have a sort of a roadmap how to get us completely out of this pickle, unfortunately. But I mean, I think something very important to keep in mind is something that comes up in the research, something that wise people do that the rest of us mere mortals don't tend to be able to do, is they can view a situation from multiple perspectives simultaneously. And it's sort of, but the human condition prevents us almost from doing that, because obviously you can only view something from one place at a time. But this naturally sort of gives us a limited understanding of any political dilemma we might face. And wise people have this facility for seeing the same situation from lots of different angles at the same time, and therefore get a much clearer understanding of what the problem is and therefore what can be done about it. So this is something that returns up in the research as something we can aspire to do.
The word wisdom, I think, carries a lot of meaning for folks out there. And I know you're saying you're coming at this from, the realm of physics and objectivity. Sure. But do you think you can give us just a concrete definition of wisdom, even if it's a bit pulled out of, ninth grade early world history in terms of philosophical value?
I mean, it's important to keep in mind wisdom isn't, it's not a scientific principle. It's not gravity. It's not time. It's a human idea. So ultimately, it's whatever we say it is. But that's a very unsatisfying answer. Now, the things that keep on coming up when scientists are trying to define it, there's a certain few themes that keep emerging in different definitions of wisdom, and wise people tend to be able to integrate intelligence with emotion. So you've got to be sharp, but you also have to be able to emotionally communicate with people. So there's that integration of intelligence and emotion. Secondly, there's that ability to consider multiple perspectives at the same time, often in contexts of great uncertainty. So if someone does something when there's no uncertainty involved, we don't consider it wise. And then finally, I think, which is really important and often overlooked, is wisdom involves trying to find an optimal outcome for the group. So it's not simply about using your intelligence and your emotional intelligence and your facility for navigating uncertainty to simply advance your own interests. That may well be considered, clever and scheming and Machiavellian, but no one would mistake that for wisdom. So that third aspect is important. It has this kind of compassionate sort of trying to find a solution that works for the circle, not just you.
Indeed, and I think in that way, it's hard to avoid the lens of ideology, or looking at that through the lens of ideology, especially for folks in the United States, especially given that we have such confusing rhetoric about individuality versus the community, and what really benefits the whole.
Go
ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, well, I think this is probably one of the reasons that this research seems to be gathering a little bit of steam at the moment is we have come through this century of individualism, which was probably really essential to counteract some of the strict hierarchies that were with huge injustices embedded in them, say from Victorian England, etc. So I think this period of individualism has been very important for us to sort of establish, equal rights, etc., that kind of thing. However, it's becoming more and more apparent, I think, as everyone is finding themselves more and more connected, that to think of solutions that can be achieved as individuals is probably becoming a little bit outmoded and no longer viable. So it seems that we have to be beginning to think of ourselves as part of a bigger group. Not necessarily from an ethical point of view, but just from the sheer practicalities of how connected we are. So, if you look at the environmental issues, you can't say, well, we in Kansas, we're going to have these environmental laws and that's going to be fine. We are, whether we like it or not, now connected inextricably. So it seems to me that's perhaps why this thinking, a problem-solving approach of wisdom, which involves this big circle thinking, is becoming more relevant to how we approach current situations.
No, of course. We've heard a lot of discussion of alternative facts over the last few months since the Trump administration has ascended. But I think the broader disconnect that we have in this anger-driven narrative that I find a lot more political discussions are motivated. I know there's a good amount of research on inherent bias and confirmation bias,
motivated,
and I think that's
reasoning, etc.
Right, and I think this feeds into a feeling that the point of politics is to be able to win the argument at Thanksgiving. Yeah. And I see this all over the place. And it's not just about winning the argument anymore. It's about winning the argument at Thanksgiving against Uncle Joe or against, you're doing it wrong. Do you think this kind of desire to focus our negativity on an object dilutes our pursuit of knowledge?
Would you just repeat that last bit a little bit for me?
Sorry,
slightly, yeah.
Sorry, forgive me. I just want to know your thoughts on what out there might be in your research in terms of directing your negativity at an object and how that obstructs humanity from really deriving knowledge and meaningful information in the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. We engage in these dialogues quite emotionally, and we just want to win at all costs. And I think one way out of that problem is to actually see adversaries as uh, perspectives that can be tapped. So if someone
Right.
sees something very differently from you, that is an opportunity for you to not necessarily agree or even compromise, but just go, oh, brilliant. What does it look like from over there? Because I can't possibly see around the back of this. Um, and
Right.
we tend to sit down and want to get people to see what we see. But what do we gain from that? I mean, really, we should be looking at it the other way. We should be accepting, firstly, that
Mm.
we're naturally limited and we can't get out of our angle and our perspective unless we enter into dialogue with people that view things differently. So when we sit down with Uncle Joe, that's our opportunity to say, brilliant, everyone in my bubble thinks what I think. This is my chance now to actually step outside it. Everyone's talking about the importance of getting out of your bubble. So these Thanksgiving dinners are those chances to do that. And things will look very different from around the back of the problem. And it doesn't mean you're compromising. It just means that's going to give you a more 360 view on it. So we
Mm-hmm.
essentially have to change our perspectives on our adversaries, not view them as just sort of time wasting people that need to be crushed, but more
Mm.
resources that we should harness.
Yet, there's so much of the attitude in the world that there are these time wasters who are the real problem. I guess that's really the nature of the toxic situation. It's that there are so many political forces out there. We were speaking a little while ago on the SpareMin app to Jim Nolt, who's a professor at NYU of political economy and writes the polarizing political economy blog for the World Policy Institute, which, full disclosure, I used to edit many, many moons ago.
Sure.
But he was talking to us about how the political economy behind labels and viewing the people who disagree with you as the other. And just even in that way, it's like the political parties themselves, and to a certain extent, the ideologies that we even see out there are built upon there are these people wasting time who are the real problem.
Yeah.
And the way that they think is the enemy.
Yeah.
And ironically enough, no matter where you're coming at it from, addressing the situation in that way only perpetuates the problem. You're only going to see more people wasting time. You're only going to see more liberals or conservatives, whoever you don't like. You'll always see more of them in the world, and I think that even leads down to the road of radicalization. But I do want to ask you this: where in your work have you discussed, or you can point us to, where we have to decide when's the time to stop listening and start acting? Because I think that's the other half of the problem, which is you're listening to the other side. You want to be respectful. You're going to hear things you don't want to hear. You're going to hear things that are as is so often discussed, politically incorrect. You should grant them an audience for your own open-mindedness. But when do we turn to action? When do we stop listening and get in the streets?
Yeah, well, absolutely. That's a really good point, because there's no point being so open-minded and so casual that you don't actually make any calls and actually do anything. So this idea of tapping other people's perspectives is simply in your sort of research phase when you're trying to work out what the best path through it is. But you do have to come up with a plan and act, but you need to hold on loosely to that plan, I think, and that's important, because otherwise you can you just make a call, you say, this is how I view it, and to show resolve and to show determination, I'm decided on this, I'm digging my heels in, and I'm moving forward. Now, obviously, you need to have a plan and largely stick to it, but you have to, one thing that wise people are able to do is navigate uncertainty. So have an idea of what the right thing to do is, but to not have it too bound up in your personality that you will not update your beliefs as things change. So I think that's another problem, is people tend to call it, like you say we're going out into the streets, and then they just become more and more it's very easy to find evidence that supports your side. So if that's what you're looking for, you'll find it. So wise people are able to go, this is what I think, this is my take on it, but I'm holding on to it quite loosely. If you can give me new information, I will update it. And it's quite hard to navigate between those, having resolve, yet at the same time being prepared to update things. Because if we're not prepared to take on board new information and update our beliefs, how on earth would you expect other people to do that? And wise people know that they don't have complete information. No one does. So it would be very foolish to at any point sort of shut the shutters and saying, that's it, I'm done. So it's a tricky one, because I don't want that to come across as saying that wise people never act on their beliefs, because they can't ever be sure of anything. You have to make a call, but you have to always, it's never the last word on it. You have to always hold on to that quite loosely.
Just getting back to what we were saying before of how we turn the tide, I think the answer, and I want to know your thoughts on this, I think the answer might lie in how well we as a culture make sacred, listening to people who are unsure, and reversing that very natural human trend to believe anybody who sounds more certain of themselves.
Yeah.
And I go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, it's just one of the things that they say. I think it's Bertrand Russell who famously said, one of the problems with the world is that all the fools are so certain and all the wise people are so uncertain. So the people that are the last people you should be listening to will sound like they're the leaders, because they've missed the grey area completely. So it's very easy to be certain when you've completely misunderstood what's going on. If you do really understand what's going on, it's very hard to be certain. So we're kind of trapped in a bit of a dilemma there.
Indeed. But I think even from an institutional sense, like I remember we're going back, I brought up my 9th grade early world history class before. Coincidentally, that was the first time, I had heard the quote, I think it's Socrates, and I think a fair amount of people bastardize it, as I might right now. But, those who say they know don't know, and so those who say they don't know have a better idea. And you don't hear that. You don't hear that in anywhere else, but in elite forms of teaching, in forms of education. And there's nothing special about that. There is nothing in my high school they had the 3 tiers of the education hierarchy in terms of which kids end up where. You had the honors kids, the college prep kids, and the special needs kids. There's nothing about that quote that all 3 couldn't understand. But I'm fairly sure that it only was given any real gravity in the elite classrooms. So I don't know. I feel as though there's an awakening here for the West in terms of the role of education and making people realize the real nature of truth. But of course, this leads to a lot of other debates as well. Anyway, Charles,
go ahead. I just was on that topic. I was reading something quite recently about. Have you come across this idea of the illusion of explanatory depth, which apparently it's this idea that people think they understand how simple things work much better than they do, like a toilet flushing, for example, or a zipper on some jeans. People think they understand how they could explain it, and then when they're asked to explain it, actually it becomes rapidly apparent that they can't really explain it. So they've tried this with policies. It's tried to get people to say, okay, tell me how the national health system works in the UK, and people go, okay, right, and off they go, and then they realize quite quickly they have very little understanding of how it actually works. And research has shown that if you ask people to say reasons why they support a policy, then they will tend to believe afterwards, they'll believe in that policy more. But if you ask people to explain how a policy that they support works, then after it, they will tend to be more moderate on their support of that policy, which I think gives us quite an interesting tool, because it's essentially saying that by getting people to sort of face up to the fact that they don't really understand the ins and outs of a particular policy, then they can become a bit more moderate on it. And that, I think, is a potential tool that one can use with Uncle Joe at Thanksgiving. It's like, okay, well, tell me how that would actually work in practice if we were going to have a new version of Obamacare, rather than like just tell me why you're against it or why you're for it.
Right.
Because it essentially puts the uncertainty right in your face. And then once you are aware that you don't really understand how something works, it's much more. You can be much more comfortable with removing your support from it. So it could be an interesting technique.
At the same time, it sounds like there's a bit of manipulation there because, I may support national defense.
Yeah.
I may support universal health care. I'm only going to be able to explain to you how either works, and one's fairly obvious and has been with us since, or been a part of public policy since ancient times. The concept of an army and national defense.
Yeah.
So to what extent do we hold people accountable in terms of their knowledge and trying to keep things from being too elitist?
Well, yeah, I understand what you're saying, because who really understands the ins and outs of anything? But I think if you're trying to encourage people to have an appropriate amount of conviction around something, it's probably important that they realize how much they do or don't understand something. So if you realize that you don't understand a policy as well as you thought, then you still may well be for it, but it'll probably open you up to the idea that it's also quite reasonable to be against it. So yeah, does that make sense?
Yes, I think that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I mean, we don't want to just be sitting around over Thanksgiving just, tricking everyone and pointing out that they don't know anything about what they're talking about. But I think it is quite a useful tool in this context, because you can't really be 100% 100% conviction for something that it's clear you don't fully understand, and that's probably a useful mechanism.
Indeed. Charles, I've had a blast talking about this on the SpareMin app with you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Likewise, Matthew. Thanks a lot. That was really interesting.